Another Man v Mob mini podcast here. Are you listening to old bad wisdom? Think about it. A lot of the wisdom that you get is just sort of status quo wisdom that you maybe got from your parents, maybe got from older relatives. Wisdom is the distillation of knowledge over time and basically the accumulation of the best pieces of of useful information. But what if that information is not really what it's being pushed as? What if some of that information really only applies to the time in which it was first used? So when you think about, I'll talk about three domains here. The first is what you often hear from your parents telling you about jobs. So a lot of the idea of what a career ought to be came from the experience that our parents had and our grandparents maybe in the job market that existed at the time that they were growing up. And that is a very specific set of circumstances. It is the post World War II baby boom era where jobs were abundant, where there was, I mean, I've heard it directly that you basically could just, as long as you were motivated, you could just stumble into a job, stumble into another job. Um, there was an abundance of opportunities on that front. And fewer credentials were required. And on top of that, it was an era where companies, employers, and employees supported each other and had more lifelong relationships in the sense of pensions were a thing. And there was the notion of a single job career, climbing the company ladder, things like that. That doesn't exist anymore. That loyalty between employee and employer is gone. There is much more of a pursuit of contract work from the employee and the employer side. It's more convenient that way. The employers don't have to pay benefits, which is something that we're going to have to talk about as a society. I hope that we can have portable benefits, but also uh, everybody's starting to value their time more. Time used to not be an asset so much. It was just like ever since the Industrial Revolution, people would sell blocks of their time and they were wage slaves. It wasn't necessarily the most interesting career as long as you had a source of income. It was something to appreciate because just before that, you had our grandparents who lived through the Great Depression. There weren't so many jobs. So when you were in the baby boom, when you came upon a decent job, granted there was an abundance of them, there was also a hell of a lot of people that would appreciate that job. So if you didn't want the job, there are a lot of people behind you that would take that job. So um, that job environment doesn't exist anymore. We're in the gig economy phase where we're moving further into gig work and freelance work, stuff like that. So the second area is education. And that has changed quite a bit if you haven't realized. The cost of education being one of the biggest things. Education used to be much cheaper. It used to be easier to get into colleges. The standards of getting into a college are much higher now. The actual degree that is offered is much less meaningful. It's required, but it's basically just like a credential that a lot of people have. It's a devalued credential. I'm not saying it's not an opportunity in the sense of that that obviously not everybody has it, but it's significantly devalued, and it not only does it matter what you choose to study, but also the quality of the education pretty much across the board, in the corruption of the institutions of higher educations themselves has significantly changed. So the push for higher education, which was taken for granted in our parents' generation, has really become a racket and a bubble at this point of pushing people towards a commodity. Education has been commoditized. It is pushed as people's ticket to the American dream, just as home ownership was pushed as people's ticket to the American dream, and that led to the devastating collapse of '08, the housing market. and people getting subprime mortgages that they should not have gotten. The same thing with the democratization of higher education and people being pushed towards it who should not have actually uh, paid for it, particularly at the ridiculously inflated cost that it has today. Now, the third thing is home ownership. There's this classic notion of, hey, invest in a home, have an asset that will increase in value, get an equity in a home. And first of all, there's this move generationally towards access over ownership, where when you live in a world with Ubers and Airbnbs, is it really necessary that you're going to want to live a highly leveraged lifestyle of owning all of this stuff when you can access it when somebody else owns it? So there's that idea, and then there's the actual deeper thing that a lot of people don't understand, which is that the thing that over time caused the value of those assets like home ownership to rise is increasing inflation and debt. So basically, if back in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s you get a home and a mortgage, then as the government starts to print more money and take on more debt, it inflates the currency, which means that newer dollars are worth less than older dollars. So if you're trying to pay down your mortgage, you're paying it down with inflated dollars, which means that it's easier to pay off. So it's easier to acquire equity, and not only that, but the inflated dollar value actually increases the cost of the asset. So the whole economy from World War II until now has been effectively a giant Ponzi scheme of inflating an infinite debt and growing it. And at some point, it collapses and explodes. And you're supposed to have intermittent easing. There's something that we do called quantitative easing, and that's basically where we just print more money and take on tremendous debt. And we've done that frequently. You're supposed to have these controlled burns, almost like in forest fires, where you have controlled forest fires every now and then, so you don't have a mega fire. And it really gets rid of a lot of the risk. And yeah, it sucks in the short term, but in the longer term, it's stability. But we've kicked the can down the road repeatedly, and effectively, um, we're going to have a mega collapse. We're going to have that mega forest fire because we didn't want to deal with the controlled burns over time. So this relates back to the advice of investing in an asset like a home, because we are no longer in that growth inflation period where you can infinitely add value to those assets through more debt. Because, well, first of all, the younger generations today, it's more difficult for them to own assets because they're stuck in a world where they already have the inflated currency, and that just means that the cost of living is extremely difficult. So they don't have their foot in the door with owning an asset. They just deal with the basically inflated cost of everyday essentials and things. I'm not saying that everybody is great at saving or anything like that, but I'm just saying simply the criteria, the environmental factors are very much not the same. Now, the other thing is, and there's a great book about this called The Price of Tomorrow. I'm almost done with it right now. Highly, highly recommend it. It's about 200 pages, easy to understand, and very comprehensive. But it talks about how technology is deflationary in the sense of you can get more for your dollar with technology. It takes all this inefficiency out of the market, and it is a massive deflationary effect. So, one example of that is 3D printing. If all of these companies can manufacture their parts locally just by 3D printing, then the whole global supply chain is no longer really needed. So you get rid of all that cost, and the other thing is artificial intelligence replacing people at various tasks, which are part of every job. So as artificial intelligence encroaches, you get rid of tons and tons and tons of jobs, and labor is one of the highest costs for the prices of things that people buy. So the trade-off to the value of technology that it adds to the system is that we increasingly lose more and more and more and more jobs. So this deflationary effect is trying to be counteracted, or I'm not saying it's trying to be counteracted. What I mean to say is the government and the financial institutions are trying to counteract the deflationary effect by pushing further on the debt. And at some point, it doesn't work anymore. We're basically at that point. And that means that the value of the assets start to collapse, and the value of cash itself, or people who own non tangible assets like homes or having portfolios, um, cash itself starts to have greater value because there's a deflationary effect. So we're living in an entirely new world right now, and there's about to be a pretty major economic collapse, and that's going to have good and bad effects. It's going to be the massive forest fire that basically clears away all of the corruption, ossification, failed institutions. It's going to clear the way for the renewal, basically, that is badly needed and is going to occur. And we need to have the conversations, I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, like I've been saying, is let's have these conversations right now about the things that we want to build, the civic unity that we're going to have. What are we going to apply that towards? So think about this stuff. Be cautious, be careful with your investments. Um, don't become too anxious or too fearful. See this as basically the night being darkest before the dawn. Shit's about to get tough. It's going to hit everybody hard. It's not going to hit everybody equally, but think about what you can do to what you can do without, and how you can ration what you have to live a more um, reduced but meaningful life, because this is going to be with us for the next 5 to 10 years, I think, this crisis that we're in, before things start to really open up to this brave new world. That's it.